set out to refute Christianity, one thing I thought is an appeal to the knowledge of the people of that time, whether it's true or not, is a great test of truth. For example, in Acts 2, Peter was speaking to this crowd, rather antagonistic, some of the Jewish leaders. And he said, you know what I'm talking about. You were there. And they do that over that. They appeal to the knowledge of their opponents for the facts of which they talk about. To me, that's one of the best tests of truth historically. And that happened over and over again in the Gospels in the book of Acts. And all they had to do, like with the resurrection, in the resurrection, where was the hardest place in the world to convince anyone it was true if it was false? Jerusalem. Where did the disciples go? They didn't go off Caesarea Philippi anywhere. They went right back to Jerusalem, where a 15-minute walk by anyone could confirm the emptiness of the tomb. And then they said, you were there, you saw it. The other is eyewitness testimony. And I put a lot of weight on this. You see, people today say, well, how do you know Jesus said that? How do you know he did that? Well, they had the same question in the New Testament times. Why? Even more so than today, because they were dying for it. And they wanted to know, is this true? Did Jesus really do this? Did he really say this? And so like in 1 John 1, how did John answer that? They said, how do we know this is true? John said, what our eyes have seen, what our ears have heard, what our hands have handled is what we're declaring unto you. In other words, we were eyewitnesses. We were there. And then with their opponents, they would say, you were there too. You saw Jesus do this. You heard him do this. And you can't get much better evidence historically than that. And we have that in the scriptures.
And they started proclaiming this movement right in the location that it happened in Jerusalem. They didn't go to Egypt or China or anywhere else and say, hey, there was a guy who rose from the dead, but you can't know anything about him. They said, no, earlier, about 50 days ago, Jesus of Nazareth was publicly crucified. In fact, some of you did it. And he is raised from the dead. That's what they were doing in that earliest moment. One of the most interesting things when you look at these claims made by Paul about the resurrection witnesses and appearing to the 500 and even all the names that show up in the gospel accounts themselves is that you've got living history. You've got the people who were there to cross-check whatever message is being there. So it's not as though that these things could have been invented and no one would have challenged it. You've got this idea that there's witnesses, go investigate them. And ancient historians loved eyewitness testimony. That's what they all wanted. Livy, Herodotus, Tacitus, that's what they wanted, was Thucydides. They all wanted eyewitness testimony to get back to the original. And that's what you have. And what Paul is doing is essentially leaving calling cards. When he mentions these names at the end of his letters, and the Gospels do the same thing, you know, and Jairus and all these people saying, hey, go investigate them. You know, Luke saying, I investigated all these things carefully. These people are still alive. Go talk to them. And so, again, it has all the ring of truth and not the ring of that conspiracy theory where they just made this thing up to invent their own religion.